I'm going to skip my normal summary of the Arms Trade Treaty, though I'm happy to talk about what it is in Q&A session, precisely because I've spent so much time discussing it in the past that we might be able to take sort of the outline of the treaty as read at this point. I'm going to start off with a quick summary of where the treaty stands in the UN and the U.S. processes, talk about a few of the concerns that I have with it, and then briefly look at the way some of the NGOs are already starting to interpret it. First, the status of the treaty. The treaty was adopted by the UN General Assembly by a vote of 154 in favor, 3 against, 23 abstentions on April 2nd. It opened for national signature on June 3rd. It was immediately signed by 67 nations. A further 5 have signed since that date, making a total of 72 national signatures. The treaty requires 50 ratifications to come into force. And of course, a ratification is not the same thing as a signature. So far, I believe only one nation has actually ratified the Arms Trade Treaty. But given the number of signatures, I think we can confidently expect that there will be 50 ratifications, perhaps by the end of this year, certainly by the beginning or early middle of 2014. And therefore, we're likely to have an arms trade treaty that is legally in effect with a meeting of states parties, I would say no later than the summer of 2014, perhaps a little earlier. Now, a number of very significant nations either voted against the arms trade treaty or abstained on it, among them China, Russia, India, Indonesia, and a number of other major actors, some of them very bad actors indeed. The U.S. says privately that it expects China will sign at some point in the future. I see no objective basis for this, but that's what they say. It looks very unlikely that Russia will sign in the near future, or indeed at all. And India is extremely hostile to the treaty and gives no sign of moving towards signature at any point, even in the distant future. This relates to some of the concerns that India has, which revolve fundamentally around the relationship between the ATT treaty and the Kashmir issue, which I'd be happy to go into if anyone is interested. The U.S. has not yet signed the arms trade treaty, but it will sign in the relatively near future. What we're waiting for is that the treaty was written in English and then translated very hurriedly into the other official UN languages. The UN is waiting for the official translations in those other foreign languages to be completed and finally approved. That will happen legally on August 28th, unless someone objects to the foreign language translations. And at that point, the U.S. will, by its own statement, be free to sign. So I would expect a U.S. signature in very late August, or perhaps in September. Really, any point after August 28th, they could sign at any point. The U.S. has conducted and has completed its formal internal review process of the treaty. This is known as a Circular 175 review. This was completed in record time. The administration announced the effective completion of this review only 6 weeks after the treaty was opened for signature. This must set some sort of land speed record for reviewing a major international treaty. As Assistant Secretary of State Tom Countryman, before the review started, said the reviews take months at a minimum, whereas in practice it took only 6 weeks. Very, very speedy review. I've been told by U.S. officials that the U.S., when it signs, does not expect to make many interpretive statements about the treaty. In other words, it plans to accept the treaty essentially as it is without adding any real interpretive gloss on it. There is no timetable for submission to the Senate for ratification, and although I'm not an expert in this area, I think the current prospects for treaty ratification in the Senate are extremely poor and are likely to remain extremely poor for the foreseeable future, because 53 senators have supported Senator Inhofe's amendment on the Arms Trade Treaty, and there has been, thanks to the outstanding leadership of Representative Mike Kelly, also very strong opposition in the House as well. But I'm not sure that the question of ratification is as central as people like to make it, because the U.S. argues it's already implementing the Arms Trade Treaty, and thus that it doesn't plan to ask for implementing legislation, and really it sees no urgency about Senate action. Now, there's substantial disagreement about whether the U.S. is actually already implementing the Arms Trade Treaty. If you take a look at what the NGOs are saying about the question of supplying arms to the rebels in Syria, they will argue quite forcefully that the U.S. is not complying with the Arms Trade Treaty. by arming the Syrian rebels. I don't want to get into the question of whether it's wise to arm the rebels or not. My view is that it's not, but that's a policy question. What is interesting is that the NGOs are already using the Arms Trade Treaty in an effort to make the argument that it is legally impossible, or at least very strongly against their understanding of the treaty, to arm the Syrian rebels. And that, I think, is a dangerous precedent going forward. We will, however, see a major U.S. push for other countries to sign, ratify, and implement the Arms Trade Treaty, though probably not through any new U.S. government programs. They will simply take their existing programs, which by and large I think are reasonable programs inherently, and repurpose them to support the Arms Trade Treaty abroad. Here, the very strong Hill opposition that we've seen in the House through the NDAA amendment spurred by Representative Kelly and adopted unanimously by the House 2 weeks ago, I think indicates just how unsupportive the Hill is likely to be of any new programs that cost any money going to implement the Arms Trade Treaty abroad. So what's the U.S. government strategy as it looks ahead in the coming months and coming years? The treaty has a lot of unclear points. It has a lot of wiggle room. It has a lot of debatable points. The U.S. government strategy is going to be to ignore all of these, to say that the treaty means exactly what it says the treaty means, to ignore questions and concerns about unclear points, and just to bulldozer ahead. This is inherent in the idea that they're not going to make many statements interpreting the treaty when they sign it. They're just going to argue that it says what we say it means, and that's the end of it. Now, unfortunately, I think that strategy has a lot to be said for it in terms of their negotiating strategy. They negotiated an unclear treaty because they recognized that a clear treaty could never have made it through the UN and would be utterly unacceptable in the United States to virtually everyone. So instead, they went for an unclear treaty, which gives them a lot of wiggle room going forward. Unfortunately, NGOs and other nations are going to seize on the lack of clarity in the treaty and argue that the most strenuous interpretation of the treaty should be applied to the United States and, to a lesser degree, to everyone else. So while unclarity has its advantages as a negotiating strategy, it also leaves the U.S. open to continuous pressure from NGOs and others going forward. The administration will, at some future date, seek ratification, but that will be, I think, a long way down the road. There will be no implementing legislation if they have their way, and there will be no new programs if they have their way. They will wait for the 6 years that have to pass before the treaty can be amended, by which point they will be out of office. And then the U.S. will face a barrage of basically hostile amendments from other countries, all of which are already lining up to many concerns they have about the supposed weaknesses of the treaty. And that, I think, really points to the NGO strategy over the long haul. We're already seeing big interpretive documents from left-wing NGOs setting out their maximalist interpretation of the treaty and arguing that, oh, by the way, the treaty needs amendment because even the maximalist interpretation doesn't go far enough. A lot more of these statements will be coming out over the coming months and years, and I am sure that all of them will take the same line. Let me just close by raising two of the issues that I think are the most pressing in this regard. The first is that the treaty creates an open field, as U.S. industry is well aware, for what are known as tertiary boycotts. And I'll illustrate that with a quick example. We make F-35s in this country, but we make them in substantial part with parts imported from foreign manufacturers in Europe, essentially. Israel is also a partner in the F-35 program, and at some point they will seek to purchase, and I would hope that we would grant them the right to purchase F-35s. If the Israelis should then do something with an F-35 that one of our European manufacturing partners disliked, the Europeans would be under very strong pressure under the terms of the ATT to cut off the supply of F-35 parts to the United States so that we in turn could not supply parts or entire planes to Israel. That's a tertiary boycott. And that, I think, is a very serious concern going forward, and one that I think no amount of treaty interpretation can really mitigate. The second concern, and this will be familiar to everyone in the room, is the question of international norming. It is quite clear that the Arms Trade Treaty is fundamentally an effort to establish a relatively weak but very easily widely interpreted treaty that can be then used to tighten down on U.S. conduct and policy through the elaboration of international norms. Let me just quote as a close the comments by Scott Stedgen, who is Oxfam America's senior lead on the Arms Trade Treaty, which he made in a public event at the American Society of International Law a couple weeks ago. I'll quote him verbatim. So the Arms Trade Treaty, won't require any change in law. I think Tom Countryman, Assistant Secretary of State, is correct. It won't require a change in law. But I believe the treaty goes further than what the U.S. currently does and what it says in Presidential Decision Directive 34. And over time, by virtue of the treaty being a global norm that stigmatizes certain types of arms transfers, it will have an effect on U.S. practice. And this group knows this very well. Well, I really couldn't have said it better myself. That's the gist of the strategy. And so when we get quotations or statements from individuals in the NGO or the administration world arguing that the treaty has a clear and precise meaning, I encourage everyone to remember this Oxfam America statement. The entire strategy behind this treaty is explicitly and admittedly on the record a strategy of global norm building with the intent to restrain U.S. conduct. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Ted, thank you so much. I apologize for having missed part of this presentation. I think I got the gist of it, though. This is not a pretty thing. Could you just put a finer point on what Congress can do under the circumstances in which the president says we don't need to bother you with this, we're just going to observe it indefinitely and perhaps have it evolve under our nose?
Let me just back up half a step from that and talk very briefly about the legal status of unsigned treaties. It's the common understanding in the media, and one sees this all the time, that treaties have to be signed and then ratified, and perhaps there's implementing legislation before they have any legal effect in the United States whatsoever. Regrettably, that is untrue. The U.S. holds, and this is not the Obama administration's interpretation, this is long-standing U.S. interpretation, that the U.S. is obliged to uphold, or not to defeat, the object and purpose of a signed but unratified treaty. Now, your next question may be, what is the object and purpose of the treaty in question? And there really is no definitive answer to that. If you go to the Arms Trade Treaty, you will see that it has an object and purpose section, but weirdly, the treaty doesn't actually require you to implement it according to its own object and purpose. Very, very strange construction. I know why that is, but it is definitely a strange piece of construction. So sort of to return to your question, Frank, the administration will rely on the object and purpose requirement to say that we have substantial discretion to interpret our obligations under the signed but unratified Arms Trade Treaty as we see fit. And it pains me to say that that is a fairly standard U.S. interpretation. Now, what can Congress do about this? Congress, under the leadership in the Senate of Senator Moran and in the House of Representative Kelly, have written a number of letters. There is a concurrent resolution out there led by those two leaders. There are individual letters that have gone out. There is Senator Inhofe's amendment, and there is the current NDA amendment approved unanimously in the House, led by Representative Kelly. At the end of the day, given the administration's argument that the ATT requires the U.S. either only to do things that it's already doing or to do things that are already in the president's discretion under the Arms Export Control Act, there is relatively limited congressional freedom to absolutely stop the administration. I think if you wanted to really put a stick in the wheel, you would have to amend the Arms Export Control Act. And I think that would be an extremely difficult thing to get through the Senate, and certainly to get presidential signature on.
Indeed. Questions or comments? Dan?
Thanks. I'm intrigued by the example you gave of the F-35. So wouldn't the European hypothetical contractor be under a contractual agreement with the prime contractor in the U.S.? And couldn't they actually win a court case in the U.S. requiring them to comply with the original agreement? Or does international law trump
There are, I mean, it's an excellent question. There are very few countries out there, and the U.S. is certainly not one of them. In fact, we are explicitly not one of them, that argues that there is any inherent right to buy arms. That remains, regardless of any contracts that have been entered into, that remains a subject ultimately for national decision and national control through our arms export control system. You can make as many contracts as you want to, but you have to get a permit to export. That under that, for that particular item, that particular contract. And if your government doesn't want to give you an export permit for really whatever reason, you're not going to get a permit. And so this is not a question of the commercial validity of your arrangements or even of the commercial importance of your arrangements. If you have a perfectly legitimate contract, but the government decides that we don't want you selling this abroad for, and this is a defense item, for some reason, that's largely the end of it. Now, there are interesting cases afoot with ITAR and the Defense Distributed 3D Gun case that sort of raise sort of interesting hypotheticals about this. But the practical reality is that companies don't, major defense manufacturers don't sue the government for permission to export because the net result of that is the government is not going to give you permission to export anything.
Well, if I may, one other factor in all of this, which makes even more problematic this arrangement, is, of course, something we talked about in the context of having Airbus manufacture our next generation of tankers. If their workforce simply decides to go on strike or to denounce what's going on here and not do the work, it's not necessarily the management's fault. But in any event, as those of you who've spent time in the Pentagon are aware, all you need to do to put a real spanner in the whole works of a program like the F-35 is delay the arrival of this stuff. So say you could litigate it, it can have a devastating effect, not just on Israel's F-35s, but ours as well.
And I would point out that we're already seeing something along these lines in the realm of cluster munitions. There is a cluster munitions convention out there. The U.S. is not a signatory. Many European, I believe all European countries are. They are now arguing, that is the NGOs in these countries are arguing, that European countries should ban any funding, which includes any pension investments, in U.S. firms that manufacture cluster munitions, because that is also a way of aiding cluster munitions. So when you start thinking about not just parts and components, think about international finance chains, think about international insurance chains. I'm always struck when administration supporters of the ATT say things like, it won't affect wholly domestic gun sales or transfers. In this day and age, my friends, almost nothing is really wholly domestic. Every big firm out there has got an international parts and components, finance, insurance chain, or all three of them.
Admiral Lyons. Yeah, there you go. Has the JCS taken a position on it?
The administration and the 175 process is supposed to include, and I presume that it did include in this case, is supposed to include full consultation with the military.
So what was their position?
It's not been publicly released. There has been no public statement that I'm aware of. But I would be I don't know what their internal position is, but obviously their objections, if there were any, were not felt to be sufficient.
The reason I'm asking, I was the JCS rep on the conventional arms limitation talks during the Carter administration. My job was to kill it. And I'm happy to report we were successful.
Mission accomplished.
Because it had the same objective. The only thing it was to do was to limit our export in areas of the Soviets' interest.
One should bear in mind, and I think this is a fair point by the treaty proponents, that the ATT is not an arms control agreement. It is a trade treaty about arms. So it falls, at least legally, into a slightly different category. I would actually say the Arms Trade Treaty is a human rights treaty, not really a trade treaty, because it's got human rights standards at the very core of it. But at least insofar as I saw the U.S. delegation at both the UN negotiating conferences, there were ATF reps, there were state reps. I did not see a representative of the uniformed services there.
And even if they were, they would not be standing in the way. Marshall, last question.
Getting back to the question of domestic arms, and the National Rifle Association has played up the small arms portion of the treaty, has caused a lot of confusion. In fact, constituent feedback is on that side of the treaty. Are they going to be able to play that card anymore, or how do you see it come down?
Well, I'm not sure I would quite call it playing that card, because although my own personal view is that the things that I am most concerned about within this treaty relate to sort of foreign policy broadly understood, I do think there are legitimate concerns about the domestic side. And they fundamentally come down to this question of norm development. You know, if you take a look at the treaty, for example, there are large chunks of the treaty that are not clearly limited to international trade or international transfers. It's vague. And I think if you wanted to make something out of it in the domestic realm, there's potential for people to do that. Now, people like myself who watched the negotiation of this treaty advised the people who were negotiating it, and in fact advised the NGOs who were clamoring for it, that you really should clearly and explicitly exempt civilian weapons that are legally owned from the scope of this treaty, because frankly, that would take away, honestly, one of the biggest talking points against it. It really would have. And that advice was explicitly and repeatedly rejected. So the treaty, as a result, does not exempt legally owned civilian firearms. I think that was a huge negotiating mistake on their part, but there's no doubt they were warned to do it, and they deliberately didn't do it. I would also add, just in closing, that we tend to think of civilian arms as being a domestic concern. Remington is foreign-owned. Winchester is foreign-owned. Glock is a foreign company. There are big firms in the U.S. firearms market that are owned really primarily in Europe, and there is a lot of importing. Roughly 3/8 of all new firearms sold in the United States annually are imported. So even if one accepts the argument that purely domestic stuff is entirely untouched by this treaty, the U.S. firearms market is very international in its corporate structure and its sales. And I don't see any way that the Arms Trade Treaty could be so interpreted now as not to potentially have some effect on that. Is that a Second Amendment question? I'll leave that for the legal specialists on the Second Amendment question. But it does seem to me that it's a question that touches on the domestic nature of the firearms market.
But Ted, just before you step down, if they were on notice that this could arise as a problem, and they explicitly and repeatedly rejected addressing it, does it not raise the legitimate question whether that was in fact the intention of the administration, at least in part?
I think that I would place perhaps some of the blame on the administration here, but I would also place a lot of the blame on the other 192 nations who were busy negotiating this document at the United Nations. As I pointed out to some of my NGO friends on the other side, if you allow civilian possession of legally owned firearms to be exempted from the treaty, a lot of nations around the world, like, for example, Syria, will look at this as a license for, let's say, Syrian rebels to start getting their hands on civilian firearms. It's very difficult to exempt the civilian side and say, oh, by the way, this doesn't apply to, groups. So a lot of nations out there really didn't. And then, of course, there are some gun-controlling nations that just don't like the idea, even for sort of fully private civilian ownership and use. So I think the U.S. was legitimately in a very difficult position here, and I'm not sure that a treaty that said what we wanted to say would ever have been accepted, which is why, as I said at the opening, the treaty is so vague. You could only get a vague treaty through the UN because there were so many disparate interests that it had to be vague.